Welcome everyone to our ongoing series of classes on the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nei Noach, the 7 universal divine commandments for all of mankind. We are in a series of classes studying the text inside of the S'dei Chemed, which is the enormous, amazing halakhic encyclopedia, Jewish law. And this series, this encyclopedia, actually covers so much of Jewish law. So here we are in the section, in the regular printed edition, I should say. We're in volume 8. And the entry is Goy. It's in alphabetical order, Hebrew alphabet. So we're in Goy, non-Jew, Gentile. And this is the 16th class. We are up to subsection Ches, number 8. For those that are following inside, we're on page Aleph, Taf Reish Yud Aleph, which would be 1611 in the actual number, in the translation of numbers. Otherwise, it's the page opposite 3220, which therefore would be page 3221, even though that's not the way it's numbered, as we've explained in previous classes. Just to remind you, each subsection here is a different topic of how, if you will, Jewish law views and is applied, or under what circumstances or to what extent, if at all, to non-Jews. Some of them were very lengthy. Otherwise, they're relatively short. Last week, number 7 was a short one, and today, number 8 is not too long, number 9 is not too long. And the ones that are pretty short are almost just references to various different places, various different great rabbis and commentaries, many of which are the contemporaries of the author of the S'dei Chemed, where they discuss it. And sometimes he makes cross-references to his own encyclopedia in other places, in other sections where he deals with this issue. And sometimes it's written and it's almost cryptic the way it's written. Now, being that this is an encyclopedia, so he didn't write it as a code of Jewish law, which is known as the Shulchan Aruch, the Jewish code of law, which is written for Jews, which there too you will find certain halackas about non-Jews, such as in the laws of idolatry. So there you'll find what is forbidden, what's permitted for the non-Jew. But it was written 500 years ago for the Jew. And likewise in the laws of Shabbos, of the Sabbath observance, so you'll find there a little bit about how it applies for the non-Jew. And surely in the Maimonides, in the Rambam, in his Mishneh Torah, where at the very end, as we discussed many times, towards the very end of his Mishneh Torah, of the Rambam's unbelievable magnum opus, in the Laws of Kings, the last chapters, well, not quite the very last ones are about Mashiach. That's 11 and 12. But before that, chapters 8, 9, and 10 are really the source in Jewish law for the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nei Noach. So that's clearly written as a direct code of law, an instruction manual. This is not written as such. As I said, some of it is cryptic, some of it is just cross-references. Now, I say that as a general, almost a disclaimer, that these classes that we're focusing on, we're learning it in depth, and it's for the sake of broadening the knowledge. And we felt that some b'nei noyach, some of you, particularly the higher level intellectual ones who want to delve into the Sheva mitzvahs, so that you will have access to this encyclopedia. It hasn't been translated into English, so at least we're going through it, and we are reading it inside, and we are orally translating and explaining, discussing to some degree. However, oftentimes, we don't come to a clear conclusion because we're not studying it as a sense of code of law. For example, I believe it was the last class, we were studying about Aver min achai, particularly eggs. So he didn't come at the end and say, okay, so the conclusion is, bottom line is, that after the whole discussion, eggs are permitted for a ben noyach to eat, or eggs are forbidden. The end was that most authorities maintain that eggs are permissible for a ben noyach. They do not fall into the category of eating a part or a limb of a live animal. And the Chasam Sofer is a minority opinion that he maintains that it is actually forbidden for a ben noyach to eat eggs. So there you have it. Now, I'm mentioning all this because I want to go back to, well, first of all, for general, but also I want to go back to a specific thing which we actually seem to have some feedback from some people that were participating in the class, not in person, but over the internet. And that is the class that we had a couple weeks ago, and that was with regards to Torah study of the Ben Noyach, of the Goy. And I'm not going to repeat the whole point. I just want to remind you, which we've said this many times, whether it was that class or whether it was previous classes, a previous series long ago, as a general rule, and the Rambam, Maimonides, rules this way as well, a Ben Noyach, a non-Jew, as a general rule, is forbidden to study Torah. And the question is why? What's the prohibition? I'm not going to get into that. However, the main exception, if we could say so, is that not only is he permitted, but rather encouraged to study Sheva mitzvahs related Torah topics. And in order for him to know what to do and what not to do and how to observe his divine mandate, he's got to study it. So that makes sense. And that's really what we're doing here, why I'm here teaching and promoting from these Jewish books, Jewish sources, Sheva mitzvahs b'nei noyach. Now, in order to know the do's and the don'ts, so to say, the code of Jewish law, which is very, very necessary and is well overdue, there are many different books out there that you are probably well aware of, which deal with Sheva mitzvahs b'nei noyach. Some of them are different styles, some of them are more mystical or more philosophical, and there is an amazing book. But I think it's worthwhile to point out one, because at least in modern times, in the English language, it's probably the first of its kind. And therefore, it's a breakthrough. And the fact that afterwards we have about a dozen other books, wonderful. But I think you have to give credit where credit is due. And this was a direct outcome. And it was a direct product of the initiation of the Rebbe Melech HaMoshiach's campaign to get and spread the Shev Mitzvahs B'nai Noach for all of mankind, which as a campaign began in the early 1980s. As a direct result of that, two people put together a book called The Path of the Righteous Gentile. I think it was Rabbi Rogalski and Chaim Chlorfine. That's the first of its kind. And that deals with Jewish law, or I should say with the divine code, the Sheva Mitzvahs laws, the way they are understood in the Torah, given by God through Moses for all of mankind, for the non-Jewish world. But then afterwards, a much more detailed book, which already has come out in several editions, is of course the Divine Code. Now, I'm promoting this is by Rabbi Moshe Weiner. I'm promoting it in the sense of this is very specific and detailed, and it's like the code of law for a non-Jew. So just as, in a certain sense, the Jew, in order to know all of the rules and regulations and all of the things that he must do and all the things that he mustn't do and how to do it, how does one keep a kosher kitchen? How does one keep Shabbos properly, etc., etc.? Well, then there's the Code of Jewish Law. And there are many, many volumes written and rewritten and made more user-friendly and condensed and so on and so on. So the Divine Code attempts to do the same for the 7 universal laws. So he has over here, and then it's translated into, there's the Hebrew, there's the English. So there's an entire chapter, Torah study for Gentiles. So I would really encourage whoever does not yet have the Divine Code to get it and to study that. And it's no contradiction to what we're doing. I just want to point out 1 or 2 points from this chapter. So, of course, he emphasizes that anything which is related to the 7 laws, by all means, a Gentile, as we said, is even encouraged to study. Then he says like this: it is permissible for a Gentile to read the 24 books of the Hebrew Bible, known as the Tanakh, even with traditional explanations of the simple meaning, like the explanations by Rashi, in order to correctly understand the verses. But it is forbidden for a Gentile to delve into study of the written Torah, except for those verses that are 7 Noachide commandments. So that goes into the category of oisek, of being involved or delving deeply into the Torah. It is obvious that it is permissible for a Gentile to recite verses from the Hebrew Bible as prayer, particularly the verses of Psalms. So there you have that. No problem with a Gentile praying and reading Psalms and reading any of Tanakh. And surely, if you're studying, not for the sake of studying Torah, but if you're studying because you want to know the little nuances and you want to be very scrupulous and very particular and very careful in the observance of the 7 laws, by all means. Deep learning of the 7 Noachide commandments and the full breadth of the Noachide code by pious Gentiles for the sake of observing their obligations. No problem. Since the Gentile is commanded by God regarding the Noachide code, and this includes the study of these precepts within Torah, the reward for this study is great. It is a spiritual reward that is like the reward for observing the Noachide commandments. So there are many exceptions to this great rule. It is actually a very severe prohibition not to study Torah. But at the same time, There are many exceptions. So I hope that we answered that. And now for today's class. Again, page Aleph, Taf Reish Yud Aleph, right-hand column, right in the middle of the page, where the letter Ches is, subsection 8. Kinyan minachri, imahani likneis mimenu, af befachis mishavet pruta. Now, laws of acquisition between one Jew and another Jew are very clear. We've mentioned this a number of times. How you transfer property from one person to the ownership of another person within two Jews is very clear. Whether it's a movable object or whether it is real estate, it's very clear. Laws of lending money, laws of renting property, whether it's a movable object or real estate, all that is very detailed, very specific, very clear. The question, though, is, what do you do between a Jew and a non-Jew? So now, for a Jew to acquire property from a non-Jew, is it possible for the Jew to buy something with even less than the value of a pruta? A pruta is the smallest currency that existed back in the times of the Mishnaic sages, biblically speaking, actually going back. So there are different coins. There's the sela, dinar, pundioin, and the pruta is like, in US currency, it's like what we would call a penny. Now, it actually does have very specific value. A US penny, 1 cent, is actually worth less than a pruta. And here we mean pruta in the literal sense. So right now, depending on the value, a pruta is possibly 5 cents, maybe even a little bit more. So, in Jewish law, that is really the demarcation point. If something is worth less than a pruta, it's considered, for most parts, to be a non-entity or to be nothing, as far as many laws are concerned. Question is, can a Jew buy something from a non-Jew for less than a pruta? Ki heichi de mahani b'schirus makim mimenu. Just as it does apply, it is usable currency for renting space from a non-Jew, linin hadarim anachri b'chatzer, with regards to the rulings that if a Jew lives in the same general courtyard, his residence and the non-Jew's residence is in the same courtyard, Chaim Siman Shin Pei Beis, in the section of the Shulchan Aruch in the laws of Shabbos, without getting into all those details, and this is very Jewish related, but it does involve the non-Jew. And I'm going to just be very general and very brief, because these laws are very intricate. One of the prohibitions, the biblical prohibitions for a Jew on the Sabbath, on Shabbos, is to transfer any item, basically, from a private domain to a public domain, or vice versa. As is the case in so many of these biblical prohibitions, the rabbis instituted a whole list of additional safeguards that they made. So there's a lot more which is rabbinically forbidden. So, for example, in this case, if you have a courtyard, or let's say a dead-end street, which you have buildings attached, like what we would call townhouses, on three sides, and one side which is open, which is for the traffic to go in and out of the people that live there, because it's a dead end, so there's nowhere to really go. So it's really for the residents. Or if you have an apartment building, which is enclosed, it's indoors, and you have an apartment building. Now, in some of these houses, whether it's this townhouse complex with one entrance and a dead end, or whether it's an apartment building, so you have one of the residents is a Jew and one of the residents is a non-Jew. So that Jew would not be permitted to carry from his private property to the common area, rabbinically speaking. Biblically, it's not a problem. Rabbinically, he can't, unless he makes something called an eruv. Now, in order to make an eruv, in certain cases, the Jew needs to have rented the space of the common area from the non-Jew. So let's keep it simple. There are 10 residents in total. 9 are Jews, 1 is a Gentile. So those 9 Jews, not only can they not carry in the common area, they can't make an eruv, which would allow them to carry, unless they rent from the Gentile, from the non-Jew, only for Shabbos, for 1 day a week, for 25 hours a week, his rights in the common area. We're not renting his house, his apartment, his space, which is his private domain. We're not touching that. But the common area, which he'll still be allowed to use freely, but we're renting that space from him. Okay, that's basically the idea. And in the Shulchan Aruch, he's saying over here that it would be permissible to pay less than a pruta to the non-Jew, and it still counts. So the question is, fine, it works there. What about buying anything from a non-Jew? Can a Jew pay less than a pruta to acquire anything from a non-Jew? The Yesh Loimar, that there is room to say, logic would mandate, the shiny hasam, that over there it's different. Don't learn from there. The Eino Yalasiluk Rishus Ba'alma, because there, all you need is for the Gentile to surrender his rights in the common area that causes a problem. Again, of course, he can still use it, but he's using it, and if we don't get him to surrender his rights by paying him something, so then he's a partner in that area on Shabbos, as he always is, and that's no good. So we need him to surrender his partnership rights. So that's why it works. It's just a formality, if you will, for him to surrender his partnership rights in that area for Shabbos. Avalikinyan, but when it comes to an actual acquisition of transferring property, Efsher, it's possible to lay mahani that it doesn't work. So therefore he's saying, don't bring me a proof from there that you can transfer ownership with less than a pruta. Perhaps if I want to buy from a non-Jew anything, any item, I have to pay at least a pruta. V'herachti k'tzas b'siyata dishmaya banitbos oishen sifkaten chai ayin shom. And the S'dei Chemed, the author here says, that I've elaborated a bit with the help of heaven. Then he gives us the exact reference where it is in letter 55. subsection 18. Valzeh kosav li yedidi hagoyin muharar Yehuda Leib Levi av bezdin kilas Carson yishmerim tzum v'chaskei. And with regards to what I wrote, my friend, the great genius, Rabbi Yehuda Leib, the chief rabbi of Carson, wrote to me, V'zel shoynoi, and I quote, Ma she'isvakeach im yedidenu haravagoyin balamudei eish naru b'kloli mois yudches mareches gimel, that which you argued with our dear friend, the great rabbi, the genius, the author of Amudei Eish, may he live and be well, in his section number 18, Al Divras Avne Miluim Siman Lamadal Sivkot Nchov Dalud, on that which another commentator who wrote on a section in the of the Jewish Code of Law, on the monetary section or the civil laws. So with Avnei Miluyim over there, the Hevi Raya, that he brought a proof. The fact that you can rent space from the non-Jew for less than the value of a pruta, which is what I was just discussing when it comes to Shabbos, you can rent his space in the common area for less than a pruta. So according to the opinion of the Radbaz, that he says when it comes to marriage, that you have to follow the recipient. In other words, basically, one of the many places where shavet pruta, the value of a pruta, plays into effect in Jewish law, which was I was saying that less than a pruta is considered a non-entity, is one of the ways for a Jewish man to betroth a Jewish woman. The way the marriage works, which is commonly the only way it's done nowadays, is called with kesef, with money, or the value, something which has value. And commonly today, everybody uses a gold wedding ring. The moment that the groom places the ring on the finger of the bride with the intention of marriage, that's his intention, that's her intention, that's the moment by Jewish law that these two people have become wedded. They're now husband and wife. Now, there is a minimum value to that gold ring. It has to be worth at least a pruta, which, whatever it is, 5 cents, 6 cents, whatever it is. You know, it's hard to get gold that's less than that, but it doesn't have to be a gold ring, technically. It is, but it doesn't have to be. And it doesn't have to be a ring. So if he's giving her something less than the value of a pruta, and she is accepting it, knowing its value, and he's giving it knowing its value, it still has to be at least a pruta. So for example, if he's using a toothpick, a wooden toothpick, brand new, straight out of the box, from the manufacturer, a brand new toothpick, and it has use. It's really, it's a real entity, and it costs money. The value of one single toothpick of wood is definitely less than a pruta. So if they both agreed on this, and he gave it to her, they're still not married. It does not work. It has to be at least a pruta. All right, but question is, in this case, V'hinei, meyaz, so he says way back, Hikshesi alavne miluim. Again, this is quoting the letter that the S'dei Chemed received. So this rabbi is saying, I asked on this avne miluim, Demai raya me'eruvin, what kind of a proof is it from that case in the tractate of Eruvin, of making this Shabbos, renting the space from the non-Jew? There, the problem is that if the non-Jew has physical space, an area which is, he has rights to the common area, that forbids the Jews from carrying. Havalim hifkir hamakoim eino yoiser. What happens if the non-Jew disowns his rights in that common area? It's known as hefker. Hefker is a concept in civil law where a person willingly can disown their property. Any property of a person. Anything. A person can take a stack of coins, cash, could take clothing, an animal, any of their property or real estate, and make a declaration that I hereby am mafkir this. I'm making it ownerless. It now became ownerless, and now the first person to grab it legally, however one grabs, I mean, if it's real estate, it's a little bit more complicated, but as long as it's a movable object, the first one to basically grab it and pick it up, boom, it's theirs. They don't pay that person anything. And as long as it was done as I just described, the original owner forfeited his rights. He does not have a right to say, just kidding, or, oh no, I didn't mean that he could get it. I wanted one of my friends to get it, or I wanted anybody else on the planet besides him to. It doesn't work like that, in general. So that's hefker. So a non-Jew can also do that. Can be mafkir, can disown his property. So, if in this case, going back to the Shabbos case, where the non-Jew is a resident in that courtyard or in that apartment building or the dead-end complex, and he disowns for Shabbos his share in the common area, that would also work. So if that works, then we don't have to pay him any money. Why are you telling me that, oh, it's got to be a pruta, or it could be less than a pruta? It's almost irrelevant. Here, let's see. So if that's the case, that the non-Jew can be mafkir, can disown his share. So according to what it says in the Talmud, in Tractate Bava Basra, page 52, Akum michimati zuzi liyoda istalik v'nasa hefker v'yochaliskes boy acher. That when it comes to a non-Jew, from the moment that he receives the payment, his ownership has left. He no longer owns whatever it is, and it becomes hefker, and someone else can now take it and take ownership. V'im kain, if so, he have a moment legabe akum for nasa hefker after loy zacha boy hayisrael. Therefore, if receiving money by a non-Jew is what actually makes that property become ownerless, even if before the Jew takes ownership, it's now ownerless, it's free for all. So what does that have to do? Why is that a proof to the laws of marriage? So parenthetically, the S'dei Chemed is adding that what he wrote that based on his logic, but actually he says it's explicit in the Talmud and in the Jewish Code of Law, and he mentions exactly where, which section. So that's the argument that the Amudei Eish has on the Avnei Miluyim. However, now says the S'dei Chemed, right after the parentheses, Achaf al Pichen, but nonetheless, Tzadku divrei Avnei Miluyim. Still in all, the words of the Avnei Miluyim are actually correct. Al pi mashakos Ran ben Edorim dafayin Aleph, based on what the commentary, the Ran, in Talmud Tractate Nedarim, page 71, says, V'zel shoynoi. And this is what it says. Ella, Mikevan shehi maskemes l'kidushei ha'ish, im vateles taito ritzoyno u'mashvei nafsha etzel habal kedover shel hefker. V'abal machnisa lo reshusa v'chuli ad kan l'shoynoi. Since when it comes to marriage, the mind frame, the opinion of the recipient, the woman, is what makes the whole difference. And therefore, since she is in agreement of accepting kiddushin, accepting marriage from this man, therefore she is completely subjecting her will, and she is, so to say, placing her mind frame, her frame of mind, I should say, to the husband as something of hefker, being ownerless, and then the husband steps in and takes her into his possession. Ad kan l'shoynoi, ein sham. V'im kein, if so, hare kiddushin shavel eruvin. So that means the marriage is like eruvin. V'im kein, hare kiddushin shavel eruvin, havel ein lilmod mizelo mokem acher. But you can't bring a proof neither from the Shabbos case of the eruvin, nor from the marriage case to prove from either of those places that, you see, if the woman wants, or if the Gentile wants, money is not an issue. And then say, oh, you see, so therefore, if a non-Jew is selling me something and he agreed to accept less than a pruta, it works. Says, no, don't bring a proof from either of those two cases. And in truth, says the S'dei Chemed, there is much more to elaborate on this. However, I'm concerned, and I didn't want to delay for that great righteous person. And it's an expression of doubling my salutations to this great person, and to his great Torah, Yehuda Leib Hanal, signed off the above mentioned Yehuda Leib. So basically, this quote of the author of the Amudei Eish is stating that when it comes to buying property for a Jew from a non-Jew, it probably does need to be, you have to pay at least a pruta, because less than a pruta doesn't count. And the fact that you're finding me a couple other places where you don't need a pruta, he says that's different. Because in the case of Shabbos, the person doesn't need any money as long as he makes it ownerless. So that's not the case when I'm buying something from a non-Jew, because if he wants to do that, that's a totally separate story. He can say, okay, this property of mine is ownerless, and then I step in and I take acquisition of it. That'll be fine, but that doesn't mean that I bought it from him. First, he removed himself from it, and then I took it from no man's land. But as far as actually acquiring it from the non-Jew, his argument is that you have to pay at least a pruta. And the same thing applies to marriage. Don't bring me a proof over there, because it all goes by there. It's not just a means of acquiring property. Marriage is not exactly that, even though the means of marriage is by giving her at least the value of a pruta. But the idea is that she is becoming the wife, and she's entering the property or the domain of this man, of her husband. And therefore she can also, in her mind, say, I accept it under these circumstances. So that's different. Okay. Now, we're up to Tess, bottom of the right-hand column. This one, I think many people are going to find quite interesting. And let me put it this way. Many people, I would say mistakenly, are under the impression that the God-given universal laws are the Ten Commandments that God gave, that he said at Mount Sinai. We know the exact day and pretty close to the exact location. Some claim we do know the location. And that is when he gave the Torah, gave the law to the Jewish people and to the entire world, their 7 mitzvahs. What happened there was God said the 10 commandments. Afterwards, when Moses went up to the mountain, he came down with the tablets, which God, on the first set of tablets originally, had actually written, engraved on these 2 tablets, the 10 commandments that he had said. Now, many people say these 10 commandments are the bedrock of society. These 10 commandments are God's law for all of mankind, etc., etc. Most of the 10 commandments, I would say, do apply to everybody. But you cannot say that the 10 commandments are for all of mankind. Now, yes, there's a lot of overlap, but it's the 7 universal laws, not the 10 commandments. I'll use one simple example. One of the 10 commandments is observing and keeping the Shabbos. It is forbidden for a non-Jew to keep Shabbos. That's it, very clear. So the fact that one of the 10 commandments is the prohibition against murder, it's not because it's one of the 10 commandments that all of mankind have that commandment, it's because it's one of the 7. And the fact that one of the 10 commandments is not to commit adultery, it's not because it's one of the 10 commandments that the non-Jewish world has to keep that commandment, it's because it's one of the 7. Now, one of the 10 commandments is loy sachmoid, not to covet, not to want, not to desire someone else's something. And in the verse it states, whether it's the person's house, the person's wife, anything which belongs to my fellow, I am not allowed to want it. So now we're going to deal over here. Does that apply to non-Jews? So if you're going to say, of course, 10 commandments, then there'd be no discussion. But no, the 10 commandments are not what the non-Jewish people have to keep. It may be easy and convenient to say keep the 10 commandments, but it's actually not really accurate. But, maybe you could kind of say that because most of the 10 are part of the 7, so whatever. But for the sake of accuracy. So let us begin. Test. Bilav deloy sachmoid. When it comes to the lav is the Aramaic term in the Talmud for a negative commandment, one of the 365 prohibitions. In the prohibition of loy sachmoid, that a person is not allowed to covet. Kasafti banitbas besifkat nchav zayin b'shem agoyin b'sefer hamakna. So again, he's giving us a reference where the S'dei Chemed is telling us where he wrote about this, in the name of the author of a sefer called Sefer HaMakneh, which again he too deals with this section of Jewish law, of civil law. That there is no such prohibition, it does not apply with regards to a non-Jew. Kevan d'chsiv bei, because this proof is, in the verse, in the 10 Commandments, it says, Re'acha, your fellow. That term means a Jew's fellow Jew. Now, for example, on the verse that says that, the verse says, V'havta l're'acha kamoicha. And it's often, commonly translated, and even if you look in, in Jewish sources, some of the Jewish English translations, whether it's in the Chumash or whether it's in the Siddur, in the prayer book, they translate it as thou or you, shall or must, love thy neighbor or thy friend or thy fellow man as thyself. That's fancy language. What it means is, and you, referring to the Jew, it's one of the 613 commandments, it's one of the 248 positive ones. It's actually, according to great sage Rabbi Akiva, it is the general principle of all of Torah. You must love your fellow Jew as thyself, not fellow man. A Jew is not obligated to love every person, every decent person, every kind person. A Jew is obligated to love every single Jew, even the not nice ones, even the annoying ones. A Jew is obligated to love every Jew as he loves himself, which is a whole discussion for itself. And if I may put it this way, that's one reason why non-Jews are fortunate, so to say, because you're not obligated to love anyone as thyself. Because how in the world is a person supposed to love someone else as themselves? You respect people, you honor people, you surely don't misuse or abuse or mistreat, etc. But to love? Talk about the emotion, the feeling in the heart of love. A Jew is obligated to love every single Jew as themselves. That is learned out from the word re'acha. Re'acha means your fellow Jew. Now, in the verse of Lo Yisachmoid, in the Ten Commandments, well, it says re'acha. Therefore, it doesn't apply to a non-Jew, between a non-Jew and a non-Jew. Or for that matter, could a Jew covet something of a non-Jew, his property? So, arguably, yes, he can, because it says you cannot desire re'acha's property. So my non-Jewish neighbor who has a house that I really desire, I want that house, arguably, it's not a problem for me to have that feeling. If it was a Jew who owned the house, I'm not allowed to want his house. I could want one just like it. I could build my house just like his. I can't want that one. But if he's a non-Jew, right now we're stating that it would be permissible. V'shagoin pri megadim b'mishpatzei siman tov reish daled seif sif katan aleph loy breira lehachi. However, he brought him down much earlier, very often in previous sections. The Pri Megadim is a primary commentary on a primary commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. So the Pri Megadim, he states he's not sure about that. He's not sure. He says it's not so simple. He's in doubt as to whether a Jew is allowed to. V'ata reisi b'shalas l'tshuvis oiri v'yishi li'yedidi agoyin avbestin kilas yasi yishmer yitzrim v'chaskem b'siman kuf chaf alef tafayin gimel seif amodalit v'diber maskil u'mashakasav. Then, says the S'dei Chemed, the author here, that now I saw in a response, and he tells us exactly which book it is, which page it is, and where over there. The Shnei HaGeoinim, Hamasig v'Hanisag, that both of these great rabbis, the critic, the one who's giving the critique, and the critique, the one who's giving it, and the one who's getting the criticism. Both of them, nakti kedasa makna einsham. They both follow the opinion of the former one, the Sefer HaMakneh, that it does not apply to a non-Jew. V'reisi b'shas l'tshuvos, harav liyedidi hagoyin habez nekilas niznov yishmertzim v'chaskem b'simach chavtes soif sifkaten kuf pei beis. Now he's making another reference to another friend of his, another contemporary, shekasav b'shem Shulchan Aruch Hagoyin Moharashaz, who he wrote in the name of the Shulchan Aruch of the genius Rabbi Shneir Zalman. That, of course, in Lubavitch world, we refer to him as the Alter Rebbe, or in Hebrew, Admar Hazaken. This is the first Chabad Lubavitch Rebbe, the founder of Chabad Lubavitch Chasidus, the author of the famous Tanya, the book of the Tanya. This is Reb Shneir Zalman of Liadi. The Rebbe, Melech HaMoshiach, is the seventh in the line of leadership, and the first in the Chabad Lubavitch dynasty is Rabbi Shneir Zalman. So amongst the many works that he did, there's the monumental Shulchan Aruch Code of Jewish Law, but not to be confused with the regular standard Code of Jewish Law, which was written by Rabbi Yosef Karo. The Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneir Zalman, wrote the Code of Jewish Law in a unimaginable, most amazing, perfect way. And it's basically based on the original Shulchan Aruch and then some, because after the Shulchan Aruch was originally written, there were many other commentaries and differences of opinion. So the Alter Rebbe gives you clarity, brings down the various opinions, and then he gives you the verdict. So this great person that we're quoting over here, so he's quoting the Shulchan Aruch of the Alter Rebbe. Many refer to it as Shulchan Aruch HaRav, the Rabbi's Shulchan Aruch, referring to the Alter Rebbe as the Rabbi, meaning his word is the final verdict when it comes to disputes in Jewish law. B'simen Tov Mem. So it's in the Shulchan Aruch, in section 440, B'kunturis Achroin Sifkat Yud Aleph. Besides the Shulchan Aruch, the text, the body of the text itself, so oftentimes he has on the bottom his notes, which is a whole separate section for itself, and that is beyond brilliant. There's no words to describe the brilliance there of the Alter Rebbe in his Kunturis Achroin. So over there, Shekosav, B'pshitus, that there the Alter Rebbe writes as a very simple, plain, matter-of-fact way, that since when it comes to this prohibition of loy sachmoid, you're not allowed to desire someone else's anything, it uses the word reyacha, just like we had in the beginning. Same point that the Sefer HaMakneh made. It doesn't apply to a non-Jew, to a Noachide. Now, says the S'dei Chemed, the Yantisham, and I took a deep look into what the Alter Rebbe writes there, that he's quoted. It's not there. The print that I have, it's not there. And then he puts in parentheses, he tells us which edition he's got. Tfus Stettin Shnas Tov Reish Chav Zayin, which was really in the lifetime of the S'dei Chemed. It is printed in a place called Stettin in the Jewish year of 5627. which would correspond to roughly 1867 or so, give or take. 1867. That edition, he says, in that Kuntres Achron, I don't see that the author, that the Alter Rebbe says that it doesn't apply to Bnei Noach because it says Reacha. V'neman aleinu adayin yedidi Rav Agoyin anal u'machzekino leitivusa dedolilon marganisa. However, this great genius that did quote it, he is trusted upon us, and therefore I show him a debt of gratitude. And obviously, it's missing. And the fact is that in that Kuntras Achron, the Alter Rebbe wrote like the Kesef Mishnah, which is the commentator on the Rambam on Maimonides. He's actually the author of the Shulchan Aruch, that is Rabbi Yosef Karo. V'yanti b'divrei Maran Kesef. And he says, I did take a look in the words of the Kesef Mishnah, Reish Hilchos Gzeila, in the beginning of the laws of stealing. V'raisi shekasav mefurash, and I saw that he writes explicitly, since there's a different verse, not the one from the Ten Commandments, not loisachmoid, but it says loisa shoykes reyacha, that you're not allowed to cheat your fellow, and again the word reyacha, the same word is used. Ein benoach bichlal, therefore, he does say over there, based on that word reyacha, that this does not include a Noachite, a non-Jew. Umiteva haloshin shel Shulchan Aruch Hanal u'meira sheyesh bo eze isur. Sorry, eze chisur loshin. And from the way the Shulchan Aruch writes it over there, it shows us that there is actually something missing over there in the language. So shuv dorashti achar sefer Shulchan Aruch Hanal. Mitfus acher. So says the S'dei Chemed, I searched for a different edition, because something is off over there. So I looked for a different edition of the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, not the one that I have. V'reisi b'sefer shnitbas bevarsha, tov reish nun hei, tfus rebalperim. So he says, I found in the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, the one printed later in Warsaw, in the year tov reish nun hei, 5655, which would be roughly the year of 1895, as opposed to 1865, years later. Printed by Rabbi Alperin, or that printing. Shekasuv boy, k'may shekasuv b'shmoi b'shal tzuvas hadar hanal. And there it is written, like the above mentioned quote, that at first I thought was a misquote, or I said I couldn't find it in my Shulchan Aruch. There I did find it. So, he found where the Alter Rebbe says, as he's quoted, that it does not apply to non-Jews, to Ben Noach. However, says the S'dei Chemed, it's not so simple to say so. As I wrote, and he tells us where in the S'dei Chemed he wrote that, and then Rabbi, who wrote a sefer called Taras Hamayim, tells us exactly where, he wrote, and I quote, Rei Acha, this word in the verse that says, your fellow, wherever you find this word throughout in the scripture, in Torah, this word is used pretty often, Rei Acha, Lav Davka Yisrael doesn't necessarily mean a Jew. Doesn't necessarily mean your fellow Jew. Elohu Adin Dinemar Reyacha Afilu Al Nachri Mishar Umois. But the same thing could apply to a fellow, a non-Jew from all the other nations as well. Kain Matzinu B'Meireno Rachav B'Sefer Shari Kedusha Chelek Aleph Shar Hei. So we find in the great Kabbalah Sefer of the disciple of the Ari, of Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, his disciple, Rabbi Chaim Vital, and he gives us an exact reference where he writes this in a Sefer called Shari Kedusha, which section, where it is, where over there comes out that Re'acha applies to a Jew's fellow human being. Uvetana Dvei Liyo, Perek Tesvav, another reference, V'agoyin bal zikukin denura kosav Re'acha mashma filu oivet kechav mazolos hametiv loy. And then there's another great rabbi who says that Re'acha implies even a non-Jew who is doing good, who's kind to the Jew. That's also Re'acha. Sefer Abris, Chelik Beis, Maimer Yud Gimel Perekei, V'kosav Shom Dezeh Davka B'nach Ro'isik B'Yeshuva Shaloylam, V'tev L'Shamayim V'Labriyos. And then another author explains that when does Re'acha apply? It only applies to the Gentile who is involved, who's oisek, who's involved in making this world a proper civil world, and his conduct and his lifestyle and his behavior is good for heaven and good for people. Meaning he's keeping the 7 mitzvahs, he's a good person. He's doing what God wants of him. That person falls into the category, according to this, of Re'acha. And you say, wait a second, but he's an idolater. He worships Avodah Zarah. Because we just referred to him as an Oivet Kechav Mazolos. So what about that? Lo nitztav ala shituf. He says, well, that's not a problem. One of the 7 mitzvahs b'nei Noach against Avodah Zarah, against idolatry, they're not commanded about shituf, as we've discussed at great length. Meaning, as long as they believe, ultimately, in Hashem, in God, the fact that they have a misconception and they're worshiping something as an intermediary, that is not forbidden for a non-Jew. So therefore, you can't say that that person does not fall into the category of Re'acha, of your fellow. Then he says, take a look in the S'dei Chemed that he quoted before the reference, what I wrote about this opinion. Amashakasa b'shem Rav Chaim Vital, oy devesi b'sham Mashakasa v'Rabbeinu b'chaye b'parshas Yisroi loy sa'aneh v'reacha eid sheker loy omar b'achicha kamishpat aksuvim mikan shehizer afilu al nachri. So he says like this. Take a look at what I wrote in the name of Rav Chaim Vital. And furthermore, I bring down over there another great rabbi, Rabbeinu Bechaya, his commentary in the section of Yisroi, in the book of Exodus, meaning on the 10 Commandments, where it says that there's a prohibition for a Jew to bear false testimony. And he says the word there again is used, Re'acha. And what does it not say? Achicha, your brother. In biblical language, there's the word achicha, which means your brother. There's the word re'acha, which is your fellow. So since it doesn't say your brother, but rather it says re'acha, that means that it's also forbidden for a Jew to bear false testimony against a non-Jew. So from here we see that it warns us even for a non-Jew. And so we find, Vayishalu ish me'es re'eu v'chuli ayin sham. And he brings a proof that it says, when the Jews left Egypt, back in the beginning of the book of Exodus, towards the beginning, when the Jews left Egypt, the Exodus, so they were commanded by God to take from them gold, silver. So they took gold, silver, clothing. And what does the verse state? Vayish alu, and they took, or borrowed, or asked. Ish meyes re'ehu, a man from his re'ah, same word as re'acha, and a woman from re'usa, same word, same root. So it uses there the word re'acha between the Hebrews, the Bnei Yisrael, the Jews, and the Egyptians. So there you have a proof that re'acha is not limited to fellow Jew. Uvesefer Teres Chaim, Perish Labin Bechaya Liyadidi Arav Agoyin Avbez and Kilas Trablus Ish Mitzvah V'Chaskem. So then there's a book called Teres Chaim, which is a commentary on the Rabbeinu Bechaya, written by my friend, a colleague of the S'dei Chemed, a contemporary of his. The Parshas Yisroi, Sif Katan Samach Gimel, Ubemashe Vesi Bekunteres E'ares Liklolim Simen Tzadik Vav Vesi Yudalot. And so he's giving us another reference to look up over there. So it comes out that the S'dei Chemed holds that it does apply. And since it uses the language reyacha, he's learning that it means fellow human being, or at least fellow decent person, not limited to fellow Jew. And therefore he's learning that in the Ten Commandments, where it says that a Jew is not allowed to covet someone else's property, it means even a non-Jews. And based on the sources, seemingly, when it says "V'havta l'reacha kamoicha," it kind of means that you have to love everyone, as long as the non-Jew is a good person, a decent person. Reyacha doesn't say achicha. So, as I mentioned at the beginning of today's class, this is an encyclopedia, not a code of law. And he's just bringing down all these different opinions, and he states his opinion as well. But in this case particularly, since he does quote the Alter Rebbe, although he himself disagrees with the Alter Rebbe, but we have no doubt in this case, because it's not just a bunch of opinions, even though amongst all the different opinions that he brought down over here, the one opinion which, practically speaking, bottom line, counts is the Alter Rebbe. And if the Alter Rebbe says something, that is the law. That is the rule. He is the most authoritative opinion, and therefore, it does not apply as he himself had found it in the Alter Rebbe, even though in the edition that he had, it wasn't there, but in a later edition he did find it. And since the Alter Rebbe, in his Shulchan Aruch, in the Kuntras Achron at the bottom, states that the word Re'acha means Jew exclusively, therefore for the Jew there's no prohibition of Lo Sachmoid, something which belongs to a non-Jew, even though that's not the direction that the S'dei Chemed seems to have gone at the end. So we're up to Yud, which is left-hand column, right in the middle of the page, basically, on page Aleph Taf Reish Yud Aleph. So until next time, wishing everyone tremendous success in learning and studying and delving and teaching, and most importantly, observing the 7 mitzvahs, B'nai Noach, the universal, divine laws, and making this world, this confused world that we're in right now, the perfect world with the advent and the coming and the complete revelation of our righteous Moshiach. May it take place immediately now. Thank you.